My name is Frances Wexler, though nobody's called me anything but Frankie since I was old enough to hold a wrench. And I was 34 the Christmas my father stood up at his own dining table and told me my flight home from Bethesda had been a mistake. I'd come back with a cane I was still learning to use, a back held together with 2 titanium rods and 7 screws, and a sea bag that still had a name strip from the hospital ship sewn into the side. I sat at his table for 45 minutes. Then he called me a drain on this family, and I left without raising my voice. The shrapnel in my spine wasn't the thing that broke me. Neither were the words at the table. It was what my grandfather said 4 days later when he opened the door of a farmhouse in Columbia County, New York, and looked at me like a stranger he half recognized. For 10 years, I had wired almost every paycheck home, believing I knew exactly what those dollars were holding up. I was wrong about all of it, and the truth was waiting for me at the end of a long bus ride into the Hudson Hills, in a cold kitchen with the smell of wood smoke and pressed apples soaked into the floorboards. Welcome to a story I have been carrying around in my chest for 2 years, and have finally found the words for. If you have ever stood in a room full of your own family and understood, very quietly, that you were the only one in the room who was actually trying, this account is for you. The hardest betrayals don't shout. They sit at the table and pass the rolls. Stay with me to the end, because the worst of it and the best of it come late. Drop a comment so I know you're here. Subscribe if you haven't, because there will be more, and I would like to know you are in the room. The house in Schenectady still smelled the same as it had when I was 11, which is to say, like artificial cinnamon and the lemon polish my mother bought in bulk at the supermarket on Balltown Road. My mother, Patricia, took my coat at the door without quite meeting my eyes. My older sister, Brianne, was already in the kitchen, arranging cheese on a slate board she had clearly bought specifically for the slate board. My brother Theo was 26 years old and standing in the corner of the living room with his hands in his pockets and the small, held breath of a man who has been waiting his whole life to be told he could exhale. I had brought presents I could not really afford. A wool scarf for my mother, a model tractor for Brianne's son, a bottle of Hudson Valley whiskey for my father, and a small notebook for Theo, because I had remembered from a phone call 2 summers earlier that he had said in passing he had been thinking about writing some things down. Old habit. When you have spent your whole life being the one who arrives carrying something, you forget how to walk through the door of a house you grew up in without an offering in both hands. I leaned the cane against the side of the couch where nobody would trip over it and lowered myself very carefully into the wingback chair my father did not sit in anymore. Brianne came in from the kitchen and said, in the bright, high voice she had been using to talk to me ever since the surgeries, "Frankie, honey, you just sit. Let us bring the things to you." She said it the way you talk to a guest who might break a porcelain figurine, and the sentence landed somewhere underneath my sternum the way a diagnosis lands. My father, Doug, came down the stairs and shook my hand. He did not hug me. He had not hugged me since I had enlisted in 2012, on the theory, which he had explained to me with the patient condescension of a man who had never himself worn a uniform, that the Navy was an unserious decision I would eventually outgrow. For 45 minutes, the 4 of them talked around me about the weather, the new traffic pattern on Erie Boulevard, Brianne's renovation, the granite, the imported tile, the small custom mudroom her husband had insisted on. Nobody asked about Helmand. Nobody asked about the rods in my spine. Nobody asked how long the recovery was going to take, or where I was planning to live, or whether the Veterans Administration had assigned me a primary care physician at the Albany Center yet, which it had not. That was fine. I had not come for sympathy. I had come because it was Christmas, and because, for 10 years, the family account had been the place every other Friday paycheck of mine had gone. And I was hoping, in some small backroom part of myself, that the subject of those 10 years might come up, the way you hope a door you have already heard unlock from the other side might finally open. It did not come up. My mother served the brisket. Brienne complimented the brisket. My father said the brisket was fine, but that the cut had been overpriced. Theo stared at the centerpiece. The clock in the front hall ticked. Halfway through the meal, my mother set her fork down and said, in the careful voice she had been using since I was 11 and had asked her, in the kitchen one Tuesday afternoon, whether I had been adopted. "Frankie, sweetheart, how long are you planning to be in town?" It was not a question. It was a clock, and it had just started running. I told her, honestly, that I did not know. The medical board had finalized my disability rating only 6 weeks earlier. I had a follow-up at Walter Reed in March that I needed to keep, and a list of specialists in the Albany area I had not yet been able to see. I was, in the most practical sense, between addresses. I was, in the more honest sense, between every part of my life at the same time. My father set his knife down at that. Doug Wexler had a way of going quiet that was louder than other men's shouting. He looked at me across the table with the expression of a man whose investment portfolio had just lost a percentage point on a Tuesday afternoon, and he said, 6 weeks discharged, and you come to my table with your hand open already. I told him my hand was not open. I told him I had come for Christmas, not for money, and that, for the record, on the matter of money, I had been the one sending it for the better part of a decade. He looked at me with the small, flat patience of a man who had spent his whole working life as a commercial real estate broker explaining to clients why their position was weaker than they thought. That money, he said, was put to use on things that mattered. I asked him what had mattered more than the orchard I had been told for 10 years I was helping to keep above water. He looked at me the way you look at someone who has tracked mud across a carpet. You come home in pieces, he said, and you come home broke, and you sit at my table acting like the world owes you a parade. Brienne studied her wine. Theo studied the brisket. My mother folded her napkin into a smaller and smaller rectangle. I waited for one of them, just one. Theo opened his mouth, closed it, looked at our father, looked at the rectangle of our mother's napkin, and did not say a word. I told my father, very quietly, that for 10 years and 3 deployments, I had wired 90% of my pay into the joint account he and my mother had set up for me when I had enlisted, on the explicit understanding that the funds were being used to keep my grandfather's orchard solvent through several bad seasons, a failing tractor, a roof on the cider barn, and a stretch of medical expenses my grandmother had run up before she died in 2017. I asked him to clarify which of those things had not, in fact, mattered. He looked at me, and he said it plain, the way another man might pass the salt. "You are a drain on this family, Francis. You always have been. I want you out of my house tonight." I stood up. It took me longer than it used to, because the rods in my back do not allow me to come up out of a chair the way I used to come up out of a chair, and I made sure the 4 of them watched every second of it. I picked up the cane. I left the gifts on the side table where I had set them. At the door, I turned back one time, and not a single person at that table met my eyes. Not my mother, not Brienne, not even Theo, who I had, on multiple occasions across our childhood, physically interposed myself between and our father's hand. The cold outside was the clean kind, the kind that scrubs the inside of your nose. I stood on the front walk and did the arithmetic, which is what I do instead of falling apart, the way some people pray and other people drink. I had $381 in checking, a disability rating that had not yet started paying out, a service record, and a body that needed at least 6 different specialists I could not yet name. The savings I should have had, the cushion that 10 years of automatic deposits should have built, simply did not exist. I had been giving it away, one bi-weekly transfer at a time, believing every word my father had ever told me about the orchard. And there was, In the entirety of the world I had been raised inside, exactly one place left that had ever felt like floor under my feet. My grandfather's. I caught the late bus from the Albany terminal, the regional line that loops east and south through the river valley toward the small towns on the Massachusetts border, the kind of towns that show up on a state map but not on a national one. The bus was almost empty. I pressed my forehead against the cold glass and let the engine noise settle on top of the other noise, the noise that lives behind my eyes since the vehicle-borne improvised explosive device went off 2 meters from the door of the Humvee I had been treating a Marine inside of. The neurologist at Bethesda had called it residual auditory hypersensitivity. I had called it, in my own private head, the long, flat ringing that does not stop, and that I had learned to live underneath the way you learn to live underneath an air conditioner. I had not spoken to my grandfather Vernon in close to 3 years. My father had always been the one to relay news. Grandpa's slowing down. Grandpa's hip is giving him trouble. Grandpa needs another cold storage compressor, and we are all going to have to chip in. I had believed every word, because my grandfather had been the one person in my childhood who had ever simply looked at me when I spoke. I was riding 2 hours through the dark on the third night of Hanukkah to help an old man hold on to a failing farm he had told me, through my father, he was barely keeping. I did not know yet that I had the entire ledger inverted. I did not know yet that the old man at the end of the bus line believed, on the basis of 9 years of carefully forwarded lies, that I had forgotten he was alive. The bus let me off at a county crossroads 12 miles east of Old Chatham, in front of a closed gas station with a single sodium light over the pumps. I walked the remaining distance on a county 2-lane with no shoulder, the cane finding the frozen ruts at the edge of the asphalt, my sea bag pulling on the side of my left shoulder, where the muscle has not been the same since the surgery. My grandfather's place sat at the end of a long, unpaved drive between 2 stone walls, the kind of stone walls New England farmers had spent 200 years pulling out of their own fields. The farmhouse was low and white and tired-looking in the December moonlight. Behind it, on the slow-rising slope of the south field, were the rows I had not seen since I was 11. The trees. 46 varieties of heritage apple on 38 acres. Some of them planted by my great-grandfather in the 1930s. Some of them grafted on by my grandfather across the decades. Some of them named after people in our family I had never met. Dorothy's Hart, Wexler Russet, Hannah Greening. In the dark and the cold of late December, they were bare and black against the snow. And from the drive, they looked like the cleaned bones of something patient. The smell hit me first, before the porch. Wood smoke from the chimney of the farmhouse. And underneath the wood smoke, the smell that had soaked into every board of every building on that property for half a century. Cut applewood, pressed cider. The sweet vinegar smell of last year's pumice mounded behind the cider barn. It came back faster than the words for it. And then a sound I was not ready for. A low, slow creaking from the wind in the high branches of the trees at the top of the slope. The orchard breathing in the wind, the way an orchard breathes in winter wind. The way it had breathed when I was 9 years old and lying on my back in the grass at the top of the south field, with my grandfather pointing out the varieties one by one. For one ugly second, my brain rewrote the sound. The creaking became the slow groan of the door of the Humvee opening after the blast, and my right hand was up before I caught it. I stood in the drive in the dark, breathing the smoke until the sound was just trees again. The porch light came on. The door opened. Vernon Wexler filled it, smaller than I remembered, grayer, in a wool shirt and reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. He looked at me across the porch for what felt like a long time. At the cane, at the bag, at my face. I braced for pity. I had had a sea bag full of it in the last 6 months, and I was done. What I got instead was a kind of confused stillness. The kind that means two people are looking at the same photograph and seeing different photographs entirely. "Francis," he said. "What in the world?" I told him the truth on the porch, because I did not have the strength to dress it up for him. "Granddad, Dad threw me out, Christmas night. I have nowhere else. I came to help with the orchard." He stepped back without speaking and held the door wider, and I walked into the kitchen, and the kitchen was warm and ordinary. A kettle on the stove, a crossword folded on the table, a radio playing classical music at low volume from the windowsill. He sat me down in a chair and put coffee in front of me before he said anything else. "Help with the orchard," he said, slowly, like a man repeating a phrase in a language he half remembered. "Francis, the orchard is not in trouble." The orchard has not been in trouble in any meaningful way since 2010. I said that could not be right. I said I had been sending money home for it for 10 years. Every deployment, every paycheck. The money, my father had told me, went straight to my grandfather for the mortgage, for the bad seasons, for the cold storage, for a new sprayer in 2017, for an irrigation upgrade 2 summers ago. The old man's face did something I have not forgotten in the 2 years since. It went pale. Then, it went very still. "What money?" he said. It was not a question. He said it the way a man says a word he is testing on his tongue to see if it might be poison. "Francis, I have not received $1 from this family in 15 years. I have not asked for one. The orchard has not had a mortgage on it since 1994. The cold storage was replaced last spring, and I paid for it out of the cider account." The kitchen tilted. I gripped the edge of the table the way you grip the rail on a moving deck. I told him there had to be a mistake, a wire that had gotten rerouted, a bookkeeping confusion, something. He shook his head, very slowly. "Your father told me, after the first deployment," he said, "that you had decided you did not want anything to do with us out here. He said the service had changed you, that you did not write, that you did not call, that you had asked him to stop forwarding our mail. He sent back, in your handwriting, what he said were your wishes. Every time I asked after you across 9 years, he said the same thing. Francis does not want us in her life." I had written to him. I had written to him from a barracks in Bahrain, from a hospital ship off the coast of Yemen, from a small medical tent in Helmand province in the long, boring stretches between casualties. I had sent him a photograph of myself standing in front of a date palm in Djibouti in 2017, on the back of which I had written that I missed him and that I had been thinking about the orchard. I had mailed him cards on his birthday and on the anniversary of my grandmother's death, every year, without exception. I had called a number that I now understood, sitting in that kitchen, had never once been his. Somewhere between me and that kitchen, 10 years of my life had been intercepted and spent, and the man I had come to rescue had spent those same 10 years believing I had decided he was not worth the postage. He put me in my father's old bedroom, which was its own small cruelty, and I lay awake in it doing inventory the way I had been trained to do inventory the year I went through corpsman's school. The house was proof against my father's story in every direction. The roof was sound. The truck in the barn ran. The cold storage building behind the cider barn was new, white, humming. There was a chest freezer in the mudroom with venison and lamb in it. The pantry could have fed 3 people for the winter. My grandfather, by every available indicator, owed nothing to anybody. He ran a small operation. He sold cider at 3 farmers markets and at the gate of the orchard on autumn weekends. And he supplied a single regional grocery cooperative with 2 heritage varieties on a long-standing handshake contract. He lived small and square and solvent. There had never been a foreclosure. There had never been a failing season that money could not reach, because the money had never reached him at all. I want to be clear about what I was doing in that bed. I was not lying there crying. I was lying there, recalculating, which, for me, is the same nervous system doing a more useful job. The bad part came later. The bad part came around 3 in the morning, when the ceiling fan turning above me started to look, in the half-light from the hall, like the rotor of the medevac that had come in for me, and my breath got short, and I had to put my left hand flat on my own chest and count my own heartbeats until the fan was just a fan again. Under the bad noise, though, was a quieter and colder question. If I was not the granddaughter who had been saving the family orchard, then who was I? For 10 years, my entire sense of myself had been built on a single load-bearing wall. I provided. I sent the money. I was the steady one, the strong one, the one who did not need anything because she was too busy being needed. Take that wall away, and I did not know what was holding up the ceiling. I had given a family that had discarded me everything I had earned, and I had done it gladly, because being useful was the only available way I had ever understood myself to be loved. I lay in my father's childhood bed in a cold New England farmhouse on the 3rd night of Hanukkah, and I understood that I was going to have to learn an entirely different way of being a person. I did not yet have a name for it. I did not yet know that the orchard was going to give me one. In the morning, he did not ask how I had slept, which I was grateful for. He made eggs on a cast-iron pan and set a mug of coffee in front of me and looked out the kitchen window at the south field, where the trees in their dormant rows held early light the way only old wood holds light. "You can stay," he said. "I will not have you under this roof out of charity. I am 76. The hip is not what it was. The right shoulder gives out about every 3rd Tuesday. I have been thinking, since the equinox, that I could use another pair of hands that knew the difference between a Wexler Russet and a Hannah Greening. You used to." I told him I had not been in an orchard in 23 years. "Trees are patient teachers," he said. "Slow learners make the best orchardists. You cannot rush a tree." I asked him why he was offering, after 10 years of believing I had abandoned him. He turned the mug a quarter turn on the table, an old man's habit. Then he said the line I have carried in my chest like a stone for the last 2 years. "Because you got off a bus in the cold and walked 2 miles to my door, Francis. Trees keep their own ledger. They remember who showed up. Money lies. Blood lies. Roots, in the end, do not." Somewhere down in the south field, a single crow lifted off a branch, and the branch sprang up, and snow fell from it in a thin shower. I had not, until that moment, believed I would cry in front of the old man. I did not cry, but I came close enough that I had to look away. He mentioned, almost in passing, as he was rinsing the eggs pan, that my brother Theo had been driving up from Schenectady about 1 weekend a month for the last 2 years to help with the pruning. He came on Saturdays, my grandfather said, and he did not tell our father. I sat with that for a long time. 2 of us, the kept quiet children, both of us already on a quiet pilgrimage to the same place, and neither of us aware of the other one. I told my grandfather I would stay through the winter. I meant it as a stopgap, a place to heal and a place to plan an exit. I did not know I was agreeing to the work that was going to put me back together, board by board, tree by tree, slow handful of dormant pruning cuts at a time, in the only way a body that has been blown apart from the inside can be put back together, which is in the open air with a job to do, in the company of one other person who has decided not to look away. The first bad one hit about a week in. A truck on the county road Jake braked at 4 in the morning down at the bottom of the hill, and I came up out of sleep with my right hand already reaching for the medical bag that was no longer beside the cot. I sat against the bed frame in the half-dark, with my forehead against my knees, until the floor stopped tilting. I made no sound, You learn not to. My grandfather found me there at dawn. He did not kneel down. He did not tell me it was going to be all right, because we both knew it was not, in any sense in which that phrase is usually meant. He said, "Put your boots on. The trees do not care what kind of night you had." I followed him out into a gray, cold morning, and he handed me a small pair of bypass pruners from the row of tools on the wall of the cider barn. He led me to the first long row of the south field, to a tree I would later learn was a Dorothy's heart, and he held up a branch and pointed at a crossing limb that was rubbing the bark of another limb. He said, "Look at this one. The crossing limb is going to wound the leader if we leave it. The cut goes at the collar, not flush. You take your time. You breathe out before you cut. A wild cut takes off 5 years of bearing wood. You cannot put that wood back. Do you understand me?" I did not, then. I would. He demonstrated. One smooth, even motion. The limb dropped into the snow with a small, dry sound. I made the next cut. My hand shook. I cut too deep, into the collar, and the cut left a ragged edge. He looked at it. He did not scold me. He said, "Francis, the tree forgives you that one. It does not forgive you the next one. Breathe." I breathed. I made the cut. It came out clean. I made the next one. By the time we had moved down 4 trees, I had stopped shaking. The cold had stopped feeling like the cold. The smell of cut applewood was a thing I had not smelled since I was 11, and it had been waiting inside my own head the entire time. I had a job to do. The job required my hands to be still. The stillness of my hands was, in the slow, physical way the body finally listens to instruction, beginning to teach the rest of me to be still as well. Walking back to the house at noon for lunch, my grandfather said, "Pruning is half the discipline of orchard work. The other half is grafting. You cannot do either one afraid. The wood feels it." I would learn what he meant by the wood feeling it across the next 9 months. I would learn it in March, when we cut scion wood from the Wexler russet to graft onto 2-year rootstock in the back greenhouse. The whip and tongue graft, which my grandfather had been making since he was 14, required a single, clean, diagonal cut on both pieces of wood, with a knife that was the sharpest object on the property. You could not be jumpy. You could not have a tremor. You could not, in the worst case, have an intrusive memory in the middle of the cut. If you did, you wasted a piece of scion wood that the orchard could not get back, because Wexler russet existed in a total of perhaps 4 orchards in the eastern United States, and one of them was ours. The grafting taught me to slow my hands until they stopped being mine and became instead an extension of the work the tree was already doing without me. By the middle of April, I had successfully grafted 19 of 23. My grandfather looked at the success rate and said only, "That is a better number than my first year. My first year, I lost all of them." The Veterans Administration in Albany had been teaching me to manage the noise with worksheets. The orchard taught me to manage it with my hands. By May, I could prune a row alone without thinking about my breathing, because the breathing had become the work. By June, I had stopped flinching when the wind moved through the high branches and made the sound it makes. By July, I had begun to sleep through the night more than 3 nights out of 7, and the cane, which had been with me on the bus from Albany, was leaning against the inside wall of the cider barn instead of being in my right hand. I was not fixed. I want to be honest about that. The rods are still in my spine. The right hip still wakes me up some mornings in the autumn before a low-pressure front. But I had found the one place in my entire adult life where being calm was not a performance I was conducting for other people. It was the whole job. The trees required it of me. The trees, for the first time in my life, were honest interlocutors. They were not going to flatter me. They were not going to ask me to be less than I was. They were going to bear fruit if I prepared them properly, and they were going to be ugly and unproductive if I did not. And the ledger between us was clean. Theo started coming up most Saturdays in February. The first time, he stood at the edge of the south field with his hands jammed into the pockets of a coat that was not warm enough, looking at me the way a kid looks at the lifeguard at a pool he has not yet been given permission to swim in. He said he was sorry about Christmas. I told him to grab a pair of loppers from the barn instead of an apology. We worked in silence for the better part of an hour, and then, in pieces, over the long, slow afternoon, the family came out of him. My brother Theo is gentle in a way our father never knew what to do with, which means our father had spent 26 years trying to grind it out of him. Theo had learned, by the time he was 13, that the only safe posture in our house was the head-down posture, and he had stayed there into adulthood, the way a fish stays in the deep part of a pond. Brienne, he told me, was deeply in something. Her husband's tax practice, which my father had been bragging about across the holidays for years, was actually a two-attorney shop that had been losing clients for 3 quarters in a row. The new build-out in Niskayuna, the imported tile, the small custom mudroom, was floated on a second loan against the Schenectady house. Brienne had had a wedding in 2021 that my mother had openly told the neighbors had cost just under $60,000. My father had paid for it, my mother had said, on the strength of a single, very good year. The trucks, the boat at the lake place in Saratoga, the new roof on the Schenectady house, the kitchen rebuild, all of it, by Theo's small, careful accounting on a frozen Saturday afternoon in a heritage apple orchard, had piled up across the same decade I had been wiring 80% of my pay into a joint account I had thought was keeping an old man's heritage farm above water. I did not say it out loud. I had a suspicion, shaped like a wrecking ball, and I was not going to swing it on a Saturday afternoon with my younger brother holding a pair of bypass loppers 6 feet away from me. But that night, at my grandfather's kitchen table, I began writing down dates and dollar amounts from memory in the back of a notebook, building the thing I had been trained to build in 2 different lives now, a case file. The Navy had taught me to build them for after-action reviews. The orchard had given me the quiet to build this one against the man who had raised me. I lost a tree in late April. It was not, as my grandfather pointed out gently later, technically my fault. It was a Wexler russet that had been showing late-stage fire blight for 2 seasons, and the previous winter's polar vortex had compromised the cambium on the south side. But I had babied it. I had pruned it 3 separate times that winter. I had wrapped the trunk in burlap against the cold. I had walked past it every morning on my way to the cider barn and had laid my hand on the bark in something that was, if I am honest, halfway to prayer. One warm morning in late April, I came out and saw that the bloom on the south side of the canopy had not set. The cambium underneath my fingernail was brown, and the smell of the wood was wrong. I stood there in the cold spring sun and prepared to take it as a verdict on me, because that is my reflex, the reflex of every overcorrecting eldest daughter, to turn every loss into a referendum on whether I tried hard enough. My grandfather came out and stood beside me and did not say anything soft. He said, "Francis, the tree was 81 years old. My father planted it in 1944. It outlived him, and it outlived your grandmother, and it has now outlived its bearing capacity. You did not kill it. You loved it too long." You can love a tree past its time, the same way a person can love a relationship past its time. The orchard is not going to thank you for the trees that did not make it. The orchard is going to thank you for the 83 trees up the slope that did. He had me take the dead tree out myself with the small chainsaw, ring by ring, down to the stump. He had me count the rings. 81. He had me carry the cut wood to the woodshed for next winter's fires. The smell of the wood as it dried over the spring and summer was the smell of every cider press at every farmer's market we worked. The tree was not gone, my grandfather said. The tree had simply changed jobs. It would warm a kitchen now, instead of feeding one. I do not think I need to explain to you why that lesson did not stay in the South Field. The phone started ringing in February, 3 weeks after Theo's first Saturday visit. My mother first, in the bright, careful voice she used when she had been instructed to repair a relationship. How was I? Was I eating? Was your grandfather being difficult? When would I be coming back to the city, where there were proper specialists and a proper VA? Not a single word about Christmas. Not a single word about the cane, or the spine, or the door. Then my father, twice, leaving voicemails that began in a manufactured warmth and curdled by the second minute. Francis, your grandfather is getting on. Somebody responsible ought to be looking at his affairs. That word, affairs, sat in my ear like a splinter. I had heard my father be warm before. He was only ever warm when he was about to ask for something. I did not return the calls. The orchard had taught me that there are sounds in the air you do not have to react to. My grandfather watched me let the phone buzz out on the kitchen table one evening, and he said, very quietly, "He is circling something, Francis." He has been circling for about 2 years now. I asked him what. The old man looked older than usual in the lamplight. "He has been after me," he said, "since the summer of 2022, to sign this property over to him. He calls it estate planning. He says it would be cleaner when I am gone. I keep saying no. He does not take well to being told no." I asked him why my father wanted a heritage apple orchard he had openly mocked across the entire 48 years of his adult life. My grandfather rotated his coffee mug a quarter turn. He said, "He does not want an orchard, Francis. He wants 38 acres on a paved county road, 12 minutes from the Taconic. There has been a vineyard developer working this corridor since the fall of 21. They have already taken the Hanrahan place. They have already taken the Mossbacher place. They have offered me twice this past summer, both times through your father, who has been quietly representing himself to them, I have come to understand, as the eventual owner of this property. He smells money. He has been telling the developer's broker that the deal is 6 months away from closing." I went to bed that night with one new line in my notebook and one new question I could not yet answer. Why did my father need me specifically erased to get his hands on this land? I asked my grandfather straight out one night in early March whether he had anything in writing about the farm. The question seemed to remind him of something he had forgotten he had. He went into the back bedroom and came out with a soft brown folder that he laid on the kitchen table under the lamp. He pushed it across to me. He said only, "I should have shown you this on the first morning. I am sorry. I had assumed your father would have been man enough by now to tell you." The first thing in the folder stopped my breath. It was a stack of letters in my father's handwriting, 1 or 2 per year, going back to 2015. Each one a careful update to my grandfather on the family's loving contributions to the orchard's upkeep. Each letter listed dollar amounts. Each letter took, as its rhetorical pose, the warm voice of a son updating an aging father on the financial generosity of the next generation. Each letter named me, sometimes by my first name and sometimes by my service rank, as one of the contributors. Doug Wexler had been writing to his own father for 9 years, telling the old man that he, Doug, was generously and quietly supporting the orchard, sometimes giving the grandchildren a token credit, never once telling my grandfather that the money was, in fact, mine. He had been laundering credit for 9 years through his own father, building a paper picture of himself as the loyal son and the loving daughter, the dutiful brother, the steady provider. He had not, by the records I was looking at in the soft brown folder, ever sent his father a single dollar of any of it. Under the letters was a stack of envelopes, my handwriting, The cards I had mailed from Bahrain and Djibouti and Helmand. The birthday cards. The photograph of me in front of the date palm. The condolence card I had sent in 2017 when my grandmother died. Every one of them returned to sender in my father's handwriting, marked refused or unknown, and addressed back to the post office box in Schenectady I had been told was my grandfather's. The old man had never seen them. My father had collected them like evidence, like exhibits in a future case, and had sent them back so that my grandfather would believe the lie my father had been telling him all along. She stopped writing. She does not want us. There it was, the story made of my own unopened mail. And then, at the very bottom of the folder, the document that changed the shape of every other document in it. A thick legal instrument on heavy paper dated August of 2017, signed in my grandfather's clear and careful hand, and witnessed by an attorney named Margaret Halloran of Hudson, New York. An irrevocable trust. He had put the orchard, all 38 acres, the cider barn, the cold storage, the farmhouse itself, and the equipment, into a trust 8 years earlier. The trust named him as trustee for life. It named me as co-trustee from the date of execution forward. It included a clause requiring the unanimous written consent of every serving trustee for any transfer, sale, subdivision, encumbrance, or change of use of the property. Which meant me. Which meant nothing could happen to the land without my hand on the pen. And my hand, until that moment in the soft brown folder under the lamp, had not even known the pen existed. I did this quiet, my grandfather said. 2 months after your grandmother died. Your father came up to the funeral and he asked, during the lunch in the church basement, about the property arrangements. He did it gently. He did it in front of the rabbi. I went home that night, and I called Margaret in the morning, and I made the trust the following week. I knew by then what Doug was. I had known by then for a long time. I named you because you were the only one in the next generation I had ever seen show up to anything. I named you, Francis, 8 years ago, and I did not tell you because I did not want you to have to be on the wrong side of him about it from a war zone. I figured the document could wait until I was gone. I did not figure on him throwing you out of his house on Christmas Eve. I sat at that kitchen table for a very long time, with 9 years of intercepted letters in my lap and a trust document my hand was already co-signed to without my having known it. And I understood, very finally, why my father had needed me erased from the picture. As long as I was estranged, absent, and quiet, he could argue in court that I had abandoned the family, that I had no interest in the property, that I had not communicated with my grandfather in 9 years, that the trust's naming of me had been a mistake of a grieving widower acting under undue influence, and that the trust should be set aside in favor of his own claim as the only adult son living within striking distance of his aging father. He had not thrown me out of his house in a temper. He had thrown me out as a tactical move on a chessboard he had been playing on for 2 years. That night, I finished the case file in the notebook, and the bottom line came to $173,000, give or take, across 10 years and 3 deployments. I could account for almost all of it. Brianne's wedding, in the part of it that had run past the original $40,000, the down payment on the new build in Niskayuna, the lake place at Saratoga, which I had not until that moment, sitting in the lamplit kitchen of a farmhouse in Columbia County, even known my parents owned. The roof, the kitchen, the trucks. My money. Every dollar of it spent making my father and my older sister comfortable while I learned to walk again in a rehabilitation ward at Bethesda. I sat with that number for a long time, waiting to feel rage, because rage would have been simpler, and rage would have been more typical of the daughter I had been raised to be. What I felt instead, looking at the number, was the cold, steady focus I used to feel before I went out the door of the medical tent on a casualty call. The focus that comes when the situation, finally, is honest. Here is what I decided at that kitchen table, and it matters to the rest of this story, so I am going to say it plain. I was not going to chase the money. The money was gone. It was tangled up in 2 real estate parcels, a long-paid wedding, and a joint account that my father controlled by signature card and had been controlling for 10 years. Chasing it would have meant 2 years in a courtroom feeding attorneys to claw back dollars that no longer existed in any recoverable form. Chasing it would also have been exactly the response my father needed me to have. He needed me loud, hysterical, litigious, embarrassing. The unstable veteran daughter losing her mind over money so he could point at me in front of a judge and say, "See? See what I told you? See what we have been carrying." So I decided to be the opposite. I would not raise my voice. I would not write a single angry email. I would not file a single complaint with the bank, the police, or the bar. I would build something real with my hands on the land the trust had already given me legal standing to defend. And I would let the truth sit in the open where everybody could see it. He had come at me with lies and a slammed door. I was going to answer with a working orchard and a stack of paperwork that did not raise its voice and did not need to. You do not win a fight like this by swinging. You win it by being undeniable. I want to say something here for anyone listening who has thought, while listening, the thing that I would have thought in your position, which is, how does anybody send money into a hole for 10 years and not check the bottom of the hole? I will tell you, because I was not a fool. I was a Navy hospital corpsman attached to a Marine reconnaissance unit, deployed mostly out of contact with anything resembling a domestic bank branch. Around year 4, I had a bad feeling and asked my father for statements on the joint account. He emailed me 3 screenshots of balances on his phone, plus a photograph of my grandfather's cider barn with a new section of metal roofing on it. "See your money at work," he wrote in the email. The metal roofing was real. It just was not on my grandfather's cider barn. And it was not new. I would later learn it was on a rental property my father owned in Rotterdam. Around year 6, I tried to log into the bank's online portal from a forward operating base in Helmand and could not, because my father had set the login up under his own email and his own phone, so the 2-factor codes went to him and not to me. I called the bank from a satellite phone on a Tuesday afternoon local time and was told by a young woman in Charlotte that splitting or closing a joint account could not be done remotely. Both holders had to walk into a branch together with photo identification. I was in a combat zone. He was 8,000 miles away. The nearest physical branch of that bank was a 9-hour flight, a connection in Frankfurt, and a war in the way. I did the things you are supposed to do. I asked, I checked, I pushed. Every door that should have let me verify the truth had a lock on it that only my father held the key to. The architecture of the account was the architecture of the fraud. It was not built by accident. It was built by a man who had spent 20 years selling commercial real estate to people who did not always read the lease and who understood, in his bones, that a key held by one party is functionally a key denied to the other. Trust did not get me. Architecture got me. If you have got family and a shared account and a long way to go, hear me when I tell you that the architecture is the thing. By June, the orchard had given me back my hands and my sleep, and the work had begun to produce real numbers. We pressed our first big batch of cider on a Friday morning at the end of August, the early bearing varieties coming in 2 weeks ahead of season because of the warm summer. The first bottle off the line was a single variety, Dorothy's Heart. My grandfather, whose right hand had begun to shake at the wrong moments for fine labels, sat at the table in the cider barn and wrote the words on a slip of paper for me to transfer to the label sheet later. Dorothy's Heart, the Wexler Orchard, established 1932. He wrote the year my great-grandfather had planted the first row. I held the first bottle of Dorothy's Heart in my left hand and felt something I had not felt in any uniform I had ever worn, which was pride that did not require any other person's permission. The orchard had made the cider. I had not made it. I had only stayed out of the orchard's way. The orchard had been doing this work, with or without anyone in our family paying attention, since 1932. I had been allowed, for one summer, to participate. The bottle in my hand was the small physical artifact of a year of staying out of the orchard's way. We formed an LLC, the three of us, with help from a young attorney in Chatham my grandfather had been doing business with at the Apple Co-op for years. Vernon Wexler, Francis Wexler, and Theo Wexler. Theo had given his notice at the hardware store in Schenectady the week after Father's Day, which he had not attended, and had moved his belongings into the small bedroom across from mine on a Saturday in early July, without ever calling our father to inform him. I located a regional veterans agricultural program based out of the Hudson Valley Farm Hub in Hurley, and through that program, I was paired with a mentor named Owen Tannehill, a Vietnam veteran who ran a small dairy and orchard combination near Stone Ridge, and who walked me through the requirements for wholesale licensing, organic certification, and federal label compliance. The Stuyvesant Co-op in Hudson, which had been my grandfather's only wholesale account on a handshake for 28 years, agreed in September to expand our placement to 4 of their 12 regional stores. The buyer, a tall, thin woman in her 50s named Hannah Lieberman, drove out to the orchard for a tasting on a Tuesday afternoon and shook my hand at the gate and told me, without making a speech of it, that she had served as a Marine intelligence officer in the First Gulf War, and that what we were doing on this land was exactly the kind of project she had been waiting to fund since she had taken over the co-op's buying program. She did not say the rest. She did not have to. The first farmers' market of the autumn was at Hudson on the second Saturday of October. A folding table under a blue pop-up tent, 3 cases of single-variety bottles stacked in a small gold pyramid, and me, terrified in a way no insurgent attack had ever managed. I am fine in a crisis. It is the small, ordinary exposures that get me. A stranger's eyes. A question I cannot control the answer to. Theo ran the front of the table because Theo, it turns out, can talk to anyone in the world once he is out from under the long shadow of our father. He told the story to every customer who slowed down. The orchard, the varieties, his grandfather, his sister, the Navy, the orchard again. The orchard always last, because Theo had understood, in some part of him that nobody in our family had ever known how to thank him for, that the story was about the orchard and not about us. Watching him, I understood that the gentleness in him our father had spent 26 years trying to grind out was the most valuable single asset our LLC owned. The orchard responded to it. The customers responded to it. The buyer from Stuyvesant had responded to it. Everybody, in the end, except the man who had raised him, had been able to see what was in him from the first sentence. We sold out by 1 in the afternoon. A woman came back twice, once to buy a bottle, and once an hour later to tell me her husband had been a Navy corpsman in Beirut in 1983. He had not, she said, talked about any of it since the truck bomb. He had been planning to come to the market with her that morning and had decided at the last minute he was not up to a crowd. She was going to set our bottle of Dorothy's Heart on his table that night, she said, and just leave it there. She did not make a speech of it. She bought 2 bottles, and she put her hand on my forearm for a beat that did not require either of us to say anything, and she walked away. I stood behind that small folding table at the Hudson Farmers Market, with the empty cases stacked at my feet and a small zippered bank pouch full of cash, and I felt the thing I had chased through 10 years of paychecks and never once caught. I felt useful to a stranger who had no claim on me. No blood, no history, nothing owed.
Just one Saturday morning,
in the cold autumn light, and a bottle of cider with my grandmother's name on the label. My father drove out to the orchard in mid-October, the first time he had been on his own father's land in nearly 8 years. And he came up the drive smiling, which was how I knew it was bad. He got out of the car in his good shoes, surveying the rows in the south field, the new sign on the cider barn that read Wexler Heritage Orchard in my grandfather's handwriting, the small magnetic sign on the side of Theo's truck. You could watch him recalculating, the nervous habit I had inherited from him and put to a different use. "Well, look at all this," he said, playing the warm father. He had come, he said, because he was concerned about my grandfather, concerned about an old man out here alone making decisions, concerned about the burden of the property on his shoulders. There was that word again. Burden. He spoke past me the entire time, addressing my grandfather as if I were an unpaid intern who had wandered into the conversation. He suggested, gently, reasonably, that the smart thing, the loving thing, the responsible thing would be for my grandfather to transfer the property into Doug's name now, for estate purposes, so that nothing would be complicated later. He said the word complicated the way another man might say the word infected. My grandfather said no. He said it flat. He said it the way an old man says a word he has already said 100 times. My father's smile did the small, thinning thing it always did when he was being told no. He turned to me for the first time in the visit. "Francis," he said, "you are letting an old man be poisoned against his own son. You walked out of my house 10 months ago, and you have been working on him out here ever since. You are going to put him in an early grave with this farm, and then you are going to find out what kind of mess you have made." I let him talk. The orchard had taught me that you do not have to react to every movement in the air. He left without coffee. From the porch of the farmhouse, I watched him kick gravel down the long drive in a car that was, by Theo's quiet account, leased 2 months past the lease's surrender date. Theo filled in the rest over the next week, scared in the way he got whenever our father had crossed his sightline. Doug Wexler was underwater. The boat at Saratoga, the lake place, a run of bad commercial leases that had not closed. A lifestyle that had been floated on bi-weekly transfers that had stopped arriving in March, when my disability holdback paperwork had cleared and my pay had finally been redirected, 10 years late, into an account that only I controlled. The vineyard developer had been quiet for months. They had moved on. Theo had heard from a friend whose father sat on the county planning board to a parcel up near Spencertown. My father did not yet know this. He was still operating on a plan he had built in 23. The plan required him to get the orchard out from under the trust. The trust required my signature. The only thing standing between Doug Wexler and the dollars he had been promising himself for 2 years was a document my own grandfather had signed in a small attorney's office in Hudson in the summer after my grandmother's funeral, with my name on it, that I had not known about until 8 weeks earlier. I went to see Margaret Halloran in Hudson on a Wednesday morning. She read the trust again in front of me, although I was certain she had it memorized by then. She looked at me over her reading glasses and said the 4 most beautiful words in the English language. "This is structurally airtight." Irrevocable, she said, meant exactly that. My grandfather could not be talked into undoing it, could not be pressured into a sale, could not be tricked into a signature in a week afternoon, because he had given up that power 8 years earlier, on purpose. He was trustee for life. I was co-trustee from the date of execution. No sale, no transfer, no subdivision could happen without my signature. She warned me, though, about the only soft place in the wall. My father's available legal move was to argue in a contested petition that my grandfather had been incompetent at the time he made the trust, or was incompetent now, and that I had unduly influenced an aging widower into naming me. So we closed that door. I made appointments. My grandfather sat for a cognitive evaluation with his primary care physician at Columbia Memorial in Hudson. The note in the chart, which I read with him at the kitchen table afterward, said in careful clinical language that he showed no impairment consistent with diminished capacity. We had a second evaluation done by a geriatric psychiatrist out of Albany Medical with the same finding. I had Margaret Halloran prepare a sworn affidavit from her own files confirming that my grandfather had come to her office alone in the summer of 2017, unaccompanied, clear-eyed, and unprompted, and had instructed her on the structure of the trust without consultation with any third party. I built a wall around the old man and the orchard out of plain, boring, verifiable paper. No theatrics, no covert recordings, no traps. Just documents that said what was true and that would keep saying it under oath long after anyone's voice gave out. My father's whole strategy required the situation to remain murky. I spent the month of October making it clear. When he came back, and I knew he would, the murk would be gone, and so would the only weapon he had. Brienne drove out to the orchard in early November. This surprised me, because Brienne did not drive on roads with frost heaves. She picked her way across the yard in suede boots and found me in the cider barn in a stained apron, sticky to the elbows. She had come, she said, to make peace. Family to family. Then she spent 15 minutes explaining why the peace required me to stop being difficult about Grandpa's estate. Dad is in a hard place, she said. And honestly, Frankie, after everything this family has done for you, you could afford to be less rigid about it. Everything the family had done for me. I set down the strainer I was holding, and I asked her, very evenly, to list it for me. She did not flinch. She listed it. They had welcomed me home at Christmas. They had not made a big deal about my, situation. The money over the years had been family money. It had all gone in and out of one pot. It was not like I had had a wedding to spend it on, or a house, or, a family. There it was, in the open, the assumption I had been suspecting for 10 years. She genuinely believed my money had been her money. She had grown up being told by both of our parents that I was the strong one, the practical one, the one who did not need things, the one who would always be fine on her own. She had built an entire comfortable adulthood on top of that lie. The marble countertops, the small custom mudroom, the destination wedding, without ever, once, questioning the foundation underneath it. I could have handed her the notebook. I could have shown her the number, the spreadsheet of bi-weekly transfers, the dollar value of her own wedding rendered in the precision of a Navy logbook. I did not. Some part of me understood, looking at her, that she was as much a product of our father as a partner to him. He had needed someone to spend the money on for 10 years, and she had been the most enthusiastic, available beneficiary. And she had not, by my best private estimate, ever asked too closely where the money was coming from, because asking too closely would have required her to consider that her sister was paying for it. She had decided, very young, not to consider it. I do not, today, blame her for the not considering as harshly as I once would have. I just told her, very quietly, that the estate was not a topic of conversation between us, and that the door was always open if she came as a sister. I walked her back to her car. She left confused. People always leave confused, in my experience, when you refuse to give them the fight they came for. The Stuyvesant Co-op set our launch date for the third Saturday in November, an open house tasting on the orchard, in conjunction with the small Hudson Valley Culinary magazine that had been wanting to do a feature on a veteran-led heritage cidery for several months. A reporter, a photographer, the buyer, Hannah, in person with a signed contract. 3 local restaurants who had agreed to carry our single varieties. 30 or 40 neighbors invited from the surrounding county. The cider barn cleaned and warmed. Long folding tables of bottles in the gold light of late autumn. Theo in a clean shirt. My grandfather in the wool jacket my grandmother had given him in 1991. I had come up that gravel drive 11 months earlier with $381 and a sea bag. And now, I had a business, a brother, an old man who had decided to live, and a reason to wake up that did not involve outrunning anything. I want to pause here for one moment, because we are almost at the part of the story you have probably been waiting for, and I do not want you to miss the way it actually went. My father had once stood up at his own dining table and told a room of his own children that I was a drain on his family. In about a week, a different room was going to hear a different account of the same 10 years. And the account was not going to come from me shouting it. It was going to come from paperwork, from a buyer, from a regional grocery cooperative, from my own younger brother, and from an old man with a coffee mug. If you have ever been written off by the people who owed you the most, you already understand exactly why I waited, and why I built it slow, and why I never once called my father to argue. Loud feels good for an evening. Undeniable lasts. Subscribe so you do not miss the next account I tell, because there is more, and I would like to know you are in the room. And come back to me now for the rest of this one, because the Saturday of the launch, Doug Wexler made one last drive out to his father's orchard, and he had no idea on the gravel drive what he was walking into. The third Saturday in November came in clear and cold, the kind of late autumn day in the Hudson Valley when the light goes gold an hour before sunset and stays that way until the air starts to smell like snow. By 2 p.m, the orchard was full. Hannah Lieberman had set up a tasting table at the south end of the cider barn. The reporter from the magazine was talking with a couple from Claverick about a Hannah Greening single variety. The photographer was working his way down the long row of bare-branched trees, the angle of the light hitting the bark exactly the way photographers want bark hit. My grandfather sat in a folding chair near the doorway of the barn, talking to Owen Tannehill, who had driven over from Stone Ridge. Theo was at the contract table with 2 of the restaurant owners, and a small crowd of neighbors I had not yet met was working through the second round of pours. I stood at the table with Hannah, pen in my hand, 2 pages of contract laid out under a small glass paperweight my grandmother had bought at a craft fair in 1988, about to sign the largest single agreement of my professional life. And I heard the tires on the gravel. My father's car came up the drive too fast. He got out and did not close the door, the way a man gets out of a car when he is no longer thinking about his car. And he came across the gravel with his good coat unbuttoned, and the warm smile was gone, just as I had known on the porch of his Schenectady house in the cold 10 months before that one day it would be. He had heard about the contract. He had heard about the magazine. He had spent 10 months telling people around Schenectady that I had isolated his elderly father out on a farm, that I was exerting undue influence on a vulnerable old man, that the orchard was the prize in a dispute he was preparing to take to court. And now, the prize was being publicly committed to the second largest food cooperative in the Hudson Valley, in front of a photographer. He understood, walking across the gravel, that he was losing the asset that was going to keep him from drowning, that he was losing it in public, and that the entire county was now going to know it had been his daughter, the one he had thrown out the door, who had built it. He did not see a launch. He saw a robbery in progress. He did not lower his voice for the crowd. He had never, in his life, considered the possibility that the audience would not be on his side. "I am sorry, folks," he announced, addressing the cider barn at a volume calibrated to the back row. "But somebody here needs to know what is actually happening on this property." The neighbors went quiet. The reporter, very slowly, set down her glass. The photographer turned and shifted the camera onto his hip. Hannah looked at me, and I set the pen down on the contract, calm as a Sunday morning, and turned to face my father across 38 acres of orchard and 40-some witnesses. I felt the old steadiness come down on me like a hand. The same steadiness that comes down on you in front of a casualty. the same steadiness that comes down on you in front of a tree. Slow hands, low voice. Work the row. What came out of him then was the speech he had been workshopping around the city for months. He aimed it at the room, not at me, because men like my father always play to the room. My daughter, he said, had come home from the service with problems. He tapped his own temple in case anybody in the crowd needed help understanding what kind. She had moved in on a confused old man, isolated him from his own family, turned him against his only son. She was, even at this moment, in the middle of stealing an estate that did not belong to her. Documents were coming. Attorneys were coming. The county would see in due time. He looked around the cider barn, and he reached, one more time, for his old, reliable word. She was, he said, a drain on this family. She always had been. And the family had carried her, and the family had had enough. I let him finish. That is the part of the afternoon I want you to hear clearly, because it is the whole story in a single physical decision. I did not raise my voice. I did not step toward him. I did not reach for the cane that was leaning against the side of the table. 11 months earlier, the same words from the same man had pushed me out the front door of a house in Schenectady into the cold. Now the same words moved through the air around me and kept going, because I had spent 11 months in a row of heritage apple trees, learning that a wild cut takes off 5 years of bearing wood, and the only way to make a clean cut is to make your hands go still on purpose. Doug Wexler was the panicked hand now. The room was the tree. The only thing the tree needed from me was that I do not match his panic. I stood in the middle of the cider barn, and I breathed out long and slow, the way my grandfather had taught me in the second week of January, and I waited for him to run out of air. When he finally stopped, chest heaving, waiting for me to scream back at him so that he could point and say, "See, look, that is what I have been telling you," I did not give him the satisfaction. I gave him instead the truth, in a flat voice, with paper. "You are right that there are documents," I said. "Let us put them on the table." I walked into the small office at the back of the cider barn and brought out the brown folder. I laid it on the contract table. I narrated it for the room. "This is an irrevocable trust," I said, dated August of 2017, drawn up by my grandfather alone, naming me co-trustee. This is the affidavit of the attorney who prepared it, confirming that he came to her office unaccompanied and clearied. These are 2 recent cognitive evaluations from his primary care physician and from a geriatric psychiatrist at Albany Medical, both finding no impairment. The orchard cannot be sold without my signature. It was never going to be sold. I set the pages down one at a time, like cards. Then I picked up the second stack. "These," I said, "are my father's letters to my grandfather. 9 years of letters, taking credit on his own behalf for supporting this orchard. And these are the cards and the photographs I mailed to my grandfather across 10 years and 3 deployments, returned unopened, in my father's handwriting, to a post office box that was not, in fact, my grandfather's. He intercepted them, returned them, and told my grandfather I did not want a relationship." I let that page sit on the table. "The money," I said, "that my father said I never sent. The burden he says I have been on this family came to $173,000 over 10 years and 3 deployments. It paid for my sister's wedding. It paid off this man's house. It paid for the lake property at Saratoga. It financed the comfortable life he is standing here defending." I turned to my father. For the first and only time in the afternoon, I addressed him directly. I kept my voice exactly as low as it had been. "You stood at your table last Christmas," I said, "and called me a drain on this family. I was the one carrying it." My grandfather rose, slowly, out of the folding chair near the door. He had to put his hand on Owen Tannehill's shoulder to come the rest of the way up. He said to the whole cider barn in his cracked old voice, "Every word she has just said is the truth. The papers in that folder back it up. I have known it for some time." Doug Wexler's face went through everything at once. The fury, the recalculation, the search for the open door. He did not apologize. Men like him do not apologize when they are cornered. They apologize only when it is useful. And there was nothing about that afternoon in the cider barn that was going to be useful to him again. He called my grandfather a senile old fool. He called me a liar. He looked around the room for a single face that believed him, and there was not one. Owen Tannehill, who had not said a word to that point, said quietly from beside my grandfather's chair, "Brother, I think it is time for you to leave." I did not gloat. There was no juice in it, and the orchard had cured me of the need for it. I picked up a bottle of Dorothy's Heart from the small pyramid on the table, the gold of the cider catching the late November light, and I walked over to my father, and I set the bottle on the long workbench beside him, gentle, the way you set down anything that you do not want to break. "Take it," I said. "It is the only thing from this orchard you are ever going to have. The gate stays open if you ever decide to come back as a father. The land is not yours. Neither am I." He looked at the bottle. He looked at me. For 1 second, something moved behind his eyes that might, in a different man with a different 50 years behind him, have become shame. Then he turned, and he walked back to the car, and he left the bottle of Dorothy's Heart sitting on the workbench, and he drove down the long gravel drive for the last time. I watched the dust settle in the late light. Then I walked back to the contract table, picked up the pen, and signed. The launch went forward. Hannah took the 4-store contract back to Hudson on the following Tuesday. The reporter ran the feature in the December issue under a photograph of my grandfather and Theo and me standing in the south field at the gate, holding 3 different bottles between us. The lawsuit my father threatened in the cider barn that afternoon never materialized, because Margaret Halloran sent his attorney the same wall of paper I had laid on the table at the launch. And there is no case to be made when every fact is already standing in daylight. Theo runs the wholesale side now. He still does the talking at markets. He laughs more than he sleeps. He has begun, this past spring, to write some things down in the notebook I gave him at Christmas of the year I do not talk about, which he has, against all odds, kept and used. My grandfather made it through the next autumn well enough to sit in the same folding chair in the doorway of the cider barn and watch us pull the largest single variety harvest of Dorothy's Heart since 1993. He is 80 now. The hip is the hip. The right hand is the right hand. He has told me twice, very quietly, in the small evenings before the wood stove, that the orchard is going to be all right. I got one letter that winter from my mother. Patricia's careful handwriting on the same good stationery she had used for thank you notes my entire childhood. 3 pages, circling and circling, and not once landing on the word that should have been on the first line. She wrote that things were complicated. She wrote that my father was not all bad. She wrote that she had always known I was the strong one who could handle being on my own. I read it twice at the same kitchen table where my grandfather had once put a coffee in front of me and changed my life. I felt the old pull, the trained reflex to fix it, to answer, to be useful to her one more time. Then I folded the letter back into the envelope and I put it in the drawer of my grandfather's writing desk, in the second drawer down on the left, where it has been sitting now for 14 months. I did not write back. Not out of cruelty, out of arithmetic. She had called me strong my entire life as the explanation for why I would get nothing. I had finally understood that you can love someone and still decline to keep paying for the privilege. The drawer was answer enough. I think about what my grandfather told me, on the first morning in the kitchen of the white farmhouse, more often than I think about almost anything else. Because in the end, it was the only family law that turned out to matter. Blood made the Wexlers in Schenectady my relatives. A stubborn old orchardist who opened a door in the cold, and a younger brother who finally stopped being afraid are the two people who made me, in the deepest and most operational sense of the word, a family. They were waiting at the end of a long bus ride into the Hudson Hills the entire time, and I had been wiring my paychecks to a different address for 10 years without knowing it. That is my story. 10 years of paychecks, one cold bus ride, a folder of intercepted letters, a trust document signed by a grieving widower in 2017, a bottle of Dorothy's Heart on a workbench in a cider barn in Columbia County, New York. If this has reminded you that the people who answer when you call matter more than the people who only share your name, take it as your sign to call them today. Trees keep their own ledger. Money lies. Blood lies. Roots, in the end, do not. If you know somebody who needs to hear this, share it with them. Drop a comment. Subscribe. I will see you in the next one.